A woman goes through an affair with a vampire, maybe? I discuss this and more on today's episode. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today I want to talk about a short story that I read, one that is about vampires and police lovers or something like that. I am referring to Draculalucard by Carol Emshwiller, which was published in 1991 in her short story collection, The Start of the End of It All. For those who don't know, Carol Emshwiller is an American writer who lived between, I think, 1921 and 2019. Lived quite a long time. And they were a writer mostly. They wrote science fiction and dramatic stories like that. They were considered one of the pretty esteemed figures in that field. They got their work published in Harlan Ellison's short story collection, one of his short story collections, which is pretty impressive given how significant Harlan Ellison is in the world of science fiction. And even Ursula K. Le Guin said that she was a pretty fantastic, magical realist, fabulous type writer. Although I have some doubts after reading this collection, which, spoilers, I was not a fan of. But I guess I'd be willing to check out more from this writer if Ursula K. Le Guin, a fantastic writer, one of my favorite writers, has said some pretty big things about her. So I might do that in the future, or it's possible this just might be the last time I ever read her work. But yeah, so very interesting. I found this at my local library. Don't forget to patronize your local libraries. They might have interesting short story collections or even dreadful ones, unfortunately. But you'll be surprised. And so without further ado, let's talk about Draculalucard. I will do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So Draculalucard focuses on a woman named Jane. That's not her real name, as we find out in the story, but she is a married woman, I believe. Again, it's not impossible, but very difficult to parse details from this story and many other stories in this collection. This woman is waiting for the bus, and she sees that she's being watched by a stranger on the corner, who then approaches her and says that his name is Alucard Snow, which seems important because Alucard is Dracula spelled backwards. And if you're familiar with the Castlevania video game series, you probably already know that. And when he asks this woman about her name, she lies and calls herself Jane, possibly because it feels unsafe to be around men, especially strange men. But I think he invites her out to a restaurant, and they go there. They're the only ones there, and they begin to get involved with one another. And she has thoughts of like the chief inspector, who is either her father or someone close to her, or what I'm suspecting is they're probably married, and she's carrying on this affair with Alucard Snow. And she begins thinking of bats and butterflies, comparing this man to a bat, and how he's hovering off the ground or something like that. Again, I don't know whether to take this literally or as sort of a metaphor for something, but that's where the Dracula comes from. And then she also tells him the truth about her name, which indicates a desire to get closer. And I think at one point they even have sex, or she thinks about having sex with him. But again, that would suggest that the affair is moving forward, and that seems to be where the story ends there. In terms of analysis, a lot of this story is hard to follow. There's a sense of magical realism as well as stream of consciousness writing, which when paired together, often I feel it doesn't really work. It makes it hard to really get into a story and understand what is being written. And I know out there you might say, well, why do you need to understand what is being written? Or this is Emshwiller's style, surely you judge it based on that rather than a Western desire to find a narrative or something like that. And that's a valid point, but I do look for other things when writing. Maybe a sense of coherence, which this seems to lack. But one of the main themes that Emshwiller is writing about here is that of the affair. Emshwiller is specifically writing about what seems to be a forbidden affair. Most affairs are forbidden when you're cheating on the one that you love, or the one that you're no longer in love with. But it does seem to be an emotional affair. In particular, this man, Alucard, seems to be giving the narrator, Jane, what someone else can't, like the chief inspector. And there's a lot of thoughts of the chief inspector while this is going on. And if you were with another man and you were thinking of, like another person at the time, that I think that would suggest that the chief inspector is her husband or something like that. I don't really know for sure, but I'm speculating because the story doesn't give us a lot of details on the matter. While having that affair, it shows the conflicted nature of Jane. And you could even argue that the use of the vampire, the bat in this story, it's like a metaphor, because bats are scary, vampires are scary, so the narrator is feeling a little bit of fear about having this affair. Maybe the fear of being found out, or the fear of this man sort of taking advantage of her in some way. Especially when you come to emotionally rely on a person in an emotional affair, it makes sense. It certainly seems like an interesting way to sort of characterize this affair. But again, the difficulty of understanding the exact nature of what is happening here does hinder the story a little bit. The other thing worth talking about in the story is the use of stream of consciousness writing. The narrator just jumps from idea to idea in this story, sometimes within the same paragraph, making it a bit difficult to follow. As you'll see me talk about in any book or short story with stream of consciousness writing, it's very challenging to get into it, and I think only a few authors really succeed at telling a compelling narrative using it. And a lot of what the narrator is talking about in this story is nonsense, like the idea of a vampire being a butterfly and going between those two ideas. There's definitely something there in sort of comparing this Alucard Snow against the narrator, Jane. But I do think, a lot of it is nonsense, maybe highlighting the ridiculousness, the absurdity of having this affair in general, of carrying on such a thing. I think it sort of highlights the narrator's sort of stressed or fearful or just out of their mind kind of mental state at that point in time. But again, there is an unclear chain of events of what's happening in this story. A lot of it is left up to the reader, and I think that can be interesting. Again, I don't need to know exactly what's happening, or I can sort of speculate, but with certain things in a story, you need to know exactly what's happening in order to follow along with it. And for that matter, there doesn't really seem to be a lot happening in these stories to begin with. A lot of these short story collections, there is something happening, but a lot of it takes place in the mind of the characters, which again is a valid writing style, but it does feel like nothing is happening as a result. We're just stuck in a character's mind, witnessing events from their perspective, hearing their thoughts, and it's a minor sort of chain of thoughts. So there's really not a lot to latch onto in these types of stories. And in the end, I feel like I walked away with very little. It's like eating a donut hole. Tasty in the moment, but I mean, you're not really feeling like you ate something of substantial nutritious value. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Draculalucard by Carol Emshwiller. Not a fan of the story, to be honest, or really any short story in this collection. It all just kind of feels very uneventful, uninteresting. Like it lacks a little pizzazz to the story. Which is why I was surprised to find that Ursula K. Le Guin was so high on Carola Emshwiller, which probably means this isn't really representative of what she's written. Maybe I should check out something else that she's written to get a real feel for her talent as a writer. So you might see me do that in the near future. It certainly would be especially around Halloween, they'd be very thematic for that. So maybe be on the lookout for that. If you read this before, or you simply want to comment on something I said here, let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear from you. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this author, this short story, or this collection if they're interested. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and vampire-based travels. Farewell.